Okay, first, thanks everyone for coming. This is a panel discussion centered primarily about the cannabis industry, and we have three experts for you. I'm just going to make a very brief introduction. I'll also give you a little bit of the ground rules for how the session will go, and then we're going to turn it over to our panelists. So the first panelist we're going to have speaking today is Todd Mitchum. Todd is who's in the middle. Todd has actually been active in the cannabis industry and has been a well-known cannabis reformer in Colorado for a number of years. Currently he is active with a company called Decorum. Decorum specializes in advising both the government and also private sector actors on how best to set up the regulatory environment for cannabis, which I think is a very interesting subject, because as you all know, the actual, God is in the details, and in the case of cannabis, God is in the regulations. Exactly, you can vote to legalize cannabis, but actually how that gets implemented on a detailed basis from a regulatory perspective is extremely important. So Todd is in the middle of those type of discussions. To Todd's immediate left is Don Rozier. Don is actually Todd's, he's his partner in Decorum. His background is that he was a county commissioner. He is a civil engineer by training. He has been, as a county commissioner, he's been involved in a number of local regulatory issues. He is currently involved in a real estate development here in Denver. And he is going to talk today about jurisdictional issues with respect to the cannabis industry. As you all know, Jeff Sessions has recently overturned the famous memo, which made clear that the federal government, for which cannabis is still a Schedule I narcotic or drug, basically overturned the memorandum that basically said that we will not interfere with states. He has removed that, so it has introduced a level of uncertainty. So Don is going to speak to the level of uncertainty that is introduced between the federal, state, and even the local level. The last person we have is Matt Kale. Okay, I would have pronounced it Kale, but Kale. So Matt Kale. And Matt has an extremely interesting background. Matt is a veteran. I think you did 2 terms in Afghanistan, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
At the end of the second of which, he was medevaced out of the country, so he was severely injured. He then went through the normal medical process to try to heal, and he found that in his case, it was virtually killing him. So in connection with that, one of the things he's done is he has actually moved to Colorado specifically to have access to a broader array of cannabis products, which he has used very successfully to heal himself. And he is now, through his organization, which is called Veterans for Natural Rights, he is now helping other vets to follow the same path. So he will speak specifically about how cannabis has been very helpful for veterans such as himself, other people suffering from PTSD, other medical issues. So the panelists will each speak for, say, 10 to 15 minutes. After that, they will throw it open for your questions. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Give him a hand. That was great, by the way. So I guess I got the short straw. I'm going to go first. So welcome, everybody. If you can't see me over here and you want to move kind of down, it's a little of an awkward setup. But let me tell you about, just quickly, I'm not going to take up a whole 10 minutes because I really want to get to your questions. I think that's what's most important. Whether you're a candidate or you're just someone concerned about where marijuana regulation is going, how each state is dealing with it, happy to talk about all of that. I will tell you, though, quickly how I got into this space. A lot of people will ask me, how did you end up working in the marijuana industry from a corporate life? It was kind of because of my mother. I know that sounds counterintuitive because when I was 16, my mother would have thrown me out of the house for marijuana. Fast forward to 2009, my mother was diagnosed with a second cancer. It was a terminal cancer. She was given about 6 months to live. A nurse whispered in her ear one day after a treatment, you should get your hands on some weed, it will help you die. So my mother did that. Now, being the rebellious woman she is and was, she literally started growing it in her house. So when I asked her, I said, Mom, you live in Ohio, you could go to jail. She goes, what are they going to do, kill me? No big deal. So she grew it, made it into muffins. It was my great-grandmother's recipe, and she's turned over in her grave several times. But essentially, she made it into these muffins. She ate a quarter of the muffin a night. Long story short, that was in 2009. She's still alive today. So in 2012, when Amendment 64 passed, I made a decision to jump into the industry full force. Since then, I've seen the regulatory structure, the environment around it, from both Democrats and Republicans change dramatically. At the federal level, our firm is working on many different federal issues with marijuana. It is not a simple solution. Everyone thinks it's as simple as legalization. It really isn't. We moved out of an era of activism and sort of advocacy, and we moved into an area now of dealing with deep politics and money, which also includes pharmaceutical industry players and people in that space who are trying to hold it at bay. The reason is because in a state like Colorado, for example, we always talk about the good that's happened in the industry. Very few people talk about the fact that prescription drug prices have dropped by an enormous percentage, which has created a bit of an issue inside the pharma space. They start to look at these different states and how they have to compete, and it requires them dropping drug costs, which is not good for their business. So they also struggle with, at the federal level, how to get their arms around legalization from the perspective that would protect it in their world, which is not going to happen. When you can grow your own medicine in your house, it tends to make it a little wobbly at the federal level to try to stop that if you're a lobbyist for Pfizer. But what we are seeing is that the political climate currently, a lot of people were hopeful that Trump would be that sort of radical president that would legalize marijuana very quickly in the spirit of business. That obviously didn't happen, and now we're seeing a lot of change going on with Jeff Sessions. I do have to say this, though, it's really positive in some respects. Jeff Sessions, by turning over the jurisdiction back to states' attorneys and really forcing them to look at it, he really created a stir in Washington, and now legislators are forced to look at it a little differently. He's basically said to Congress, this is your fault, and you need to fix it, and I'm not going to protect it anymore. Now, that doesn't mean he's going after it, but it also doesn't mean that he's going to take the responsibility for it, which is a fascinating turn of events. It gives us a little hope because now we're working with lawmakers at the Capitol to actually move this forward. I can tell you this, it's good to be a libertarian, even though not everyone believes that about us, but let me tell you, on the Republican side, they're starting to look at this from a business perspective differently, but the Democrats are failing on it. They're starting to look at it as only a social justice issue. And even though that is a really important part, medically, veterans should be able to get access, and people who went to jail for selling a dime bag of marijuana 10 years ago should definitely not be in jail for that in a state like Colorado. I agree with all that. However, that's not the big picture. And if we don't look at it from an economic development standpoint, in other words, right now the marijuana market, illegal and legal, makes up for about $90 to $100 billion. Legally, the market's only at about $7 billion, technically speaking. So we've got a lot of headspace and a lot of coverage that we could still grow into. Our estimates on our team are that we could be looking at, with legalization of marijuana and hemp, by the way, because they both fit under cannabis, we could be looking at 3.5 to 4 million jobs in the next 2 to 3 years, with a 90 billion revenue stream, enormous amounts of dollars to put into infrastructure. And one of the examples of that is here in Colorado, that home prices around dispensaries actually went up in the last 5 years, not down. So if you look at an area, if you're familiar, I'm assuming a lot of you are from Denver or from this region, the strip of Colfax Avenue, as an example, was a desolate, dangerous, horrible place to visit. You had your life in your own hands. Now there's a Starbucks every couple blocks on Colfax. There are dispensaries literally every 2 to 3 blocks. Grocery stores have popped up. Home prices have climbed. New development, new construction in those areas has gone up. So there's an economic engine that cannabis is driving. And so we can talk about all of that. There's a lot happening. The fight is not over. It's really just beginning with states like California and dealing with the federal government. So we've got a lot happening, lots of moving parts. And I can promise you this, as simple as we all think it is, there is no simplicity to the solution. Legalization is complicated. There are lots of hands in the cookie jar as far as revenue and where tax dollars go and what happens to Medicare and Medicaid when that happens. What do we do when this product is in the marketplace and patients and veterans can get access to it constantly? That's going to be a really good thing for a lot of us. It's also going to be really bad for high profit businesses like pharmaceutical companies. And so we're going to have to deal with that. We can't just put our heads in the sand and think there's a switch to flip. So With that, I'm going to turn it over to everyone else, but thank you, and I'll answer a lot of your all of your questions as well. Go ahead, Don.
You're going to answer all the questions.
I'm going to answer literally all of them, Don. Yeah. Go ahead.
Thanks, Todd. There we go. Hello?
Good?
Good? Good. Good.
2 minutes ago. It'll
Well,
be good.
It's good?
It will
All right.
be.
And you're loud anyway.
It will be good.
Believe.
I'm loud. I love this. I am Don Rozier. Good afternoon, by the way. First, I just want to start by saying that
There you go.
Todd doesn't like to share. So I'll steal his mic anyway. Good afternoon, Don Rozier. I just there. Now it's good. Now I can have both. Little background on myself, real quick. I'm a 5th generation Colorado.
You're pushing the button.
Just take this one.
No, I'm good now. I just pushed the button. I'm good. I'm going to push Todd's button. So I was born and raised in Jefferson County. I am a registered professional engineer. My specialty is water resources, river morphology, sediment transport. So I'm really concerned with availability, like we all are here in Colorado with water, and making sure that we have safe, good drinking water to consume. I am a 2-term Jefferson County Commissioner. I served those terms I was elected in 2010 and then re-elected again in 2016, actually 2014. I have been a business owner for many years here in Jefferson County, or here in Colorado in Jefferson County, and I've had an opportunity to go around the world as an engineer and as a business professional. Real quick, let's talk about Amendment 64. What did it mean to the state and county government and then also city government? With the passage of Amendment 64, most of the rulemaking, as you all know, got pushed down from the state level to the county and then to the city levels. So I was an acting county commissioner at the time. We were asked, do you want to have retail marijuana sales within the county? And we could have made the decision as a county commissioners, or we could have taken it out to a vote of everyone within the county. And depending on how we voted, up or down, then within the unincorporated areas of Jefferson County, we could see dispensaries be established. The cities also then had an opportunities within counties to do the same vote. So if Jefferson County voted no, we did not want retail sales of marijuana, then each individual city could vote up or down on such an action. So we saw in Arvada says 0 retail sales of marijuana. Lakewood took a different approach. They have medical marijuana. Same thing, Wheat Ridge. You look at Edgewater. Edgewater voted yes for medical and for retail sales. It has made a huge difference in Edgewater. So I don't know if many of you know where Edgewater is. It's right on the eastern boundary of Jefferson County, right before you get into Denver County. And Edgewater was struggling pretty bad. St. Anthony's Hospital had recently moved to their new location within Lakewood, and they had lost a lot of business that would go from the hospital over to and go into their retail stores along the Sheridan corridor. They didn't know how they were going to survive. With the legalization of marijuana, that city is booming. They have actually had an opportunity to pave every street within their city, redo their water infrastructure and their sewer infrastructure, and now they're building a brand new city hall. Now I say that with a little bit of a caveat, because there are many counties and many cities who viewed retail marijuana as a saving grace, and they're going to tax the heck out of it. What happens when you see excise tax after excise tax after excise tax? It creates a black market. He goes right into that. So we saw many cities and many counties look at it as that saving grace, and it's not. It's a part of the process. It should not be relied on. We see that even at the state government level, where they say, we need more road money. We need school money. We need this money. Where are we going to get it? Number one thing that comes up, I'll just increase the taxes on marijuana. Right? And it just puts it back into that gray market. We cannot keep going in that direction. We have to look at it holistically. We need to look at it as a business. One item, when I sat as a county commissioner, we had a steering committee that we set up on retail sales of marijuana. We did not jump into the game. We did not make a decision immediately. And let me tell you why. Because we wanted to see and understand. I wanted to understand the pros and the cons. I wanted to understand the market. I did not want a business to come in to invest millions of dollars for a decision to be made, and then they were out their dollars immediately. It was going to be a smart decision. It was going to be an educated decision. Plus, to be quite honest with you, I wanted to see all the mistakes City and County of Denver was making. Uh-oh, it's videotaped. I better be careful. I love you, Mayor. There were many, and there still continues to be different mistakes. But what I'm getting at here is when you look at how regulations occurred, just because it happens a certain way in Edgewater or Wheat Ridge or Denver or Aurora, it's different every time a business tries to locate within those areas. And it's very restrictive, and it still creates that market for the black market to come in. And making sure that we go in the right direction, making sure that we get a policy in place, I guess, a better way to look at it, with marijuana and with hemp, and how we deal with it. I'm also a big supporter of the hemp industry. I have some stepbrothers who are farmers, and hemp is a great crop for them, especially in Colorado because of the use of water. Something else that's near and dear to my heart. When you look at what you can do with hemp, from the fiber to the seeds to CBD oil, are amazing. So we're going to see a hemp industry here. It's lagging behind the marijuana industry. You're going to see a hemp industry that is poised to be huge throughout the nation. I'm going to leave it there. I'm sure there's a lot of questions that are all going to Todd, as he mentioned. Todd will answer them all, but I'm going to pass it on. Thank you.
I'll let you answer.
Okay. So my name is Matthew Kale. I'm the Executive Director of Veterans for Natural Rights. We're a veterans advocacy organization on the Front Range. We build communities where veterans can heal, find their voice, and then change the world. Our credo is pretty simple: freedom equally for everyone. We represent a natural rights position on the Constitution before the legislature, and that's to protect personal freedom and individual liberties in America. We do this because we swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. It's our enlistment oath. No one has ever relieved me of that oath, and I don't think anybody's relieved any other veteran from that oath either. So they trained us to carry flags through thick and thin, fire and brimstone. And now that we are back here in the States, pounding our own swords to plowshares, we still carry that flag, and that flag is freedom. Natural rights are often listed as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness if you're talking to Jefferson, or life, liberty, and property if you're talking to Locke. But naturally from property comes the right to trade that property. But there's one more natural right that's mentioned in the Declaration of Independence that's often overlooked, and that's equality under the law. The founders were pretty clever, though, and they understood that an individual's freedoms were not limited by our founding documents, but rather its purpose was to limit the agency of government to do anything about those freedoms. The Ninth Amendment was specifically to guarantee additional rights not delineated in the Constitution. One of our founders, Benjamin Rush, he was a physician, and even he knew that the medical profession would soon become an instrument of extortion for the people of America. So he proposed actually protecting our medical freedoms in the Constitution with an amendment that never actually got put down there. So Hippocrates, the founder of Western medicine and the originator of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. First do no harm, and he famously said, if you're not your own doctor, you're a fool. And for that reason, and the other reasons I mentioned, we believe that medical freedom and cognitive liberty are the birthrights of every single American, not just veterans. But we are, of course, here to fight for your freedoms too. And sometimes when we're sent into unjust wars, fighting for dubious objectives, we come back with PTSD. The Japanese have a technique called kintsukuroi. I'm totally mangling that. Sorry about that. Kintsukuroi. It means to repair with gold. And it's the art of repairing pottery with gold with the understanding that the piece is even more beautiful for having been broken. And in a very real way, veterans represent the cracks in a society that have been damaged by endless cycles of war. We're fighting a lot out there. And they're sending us back out and back out and back out. Most of these wars, as we all know, they're not fought really for the safety or good of the American people. They're done for special interests. But we believe that if we can heal the veteran, then possibly we might be able to heal the world. So, we are undoubtedly the poster children for the phenomenon of PTSD in America right now, but it's really our job now that we've gone over and had to be exposed to all this stuff to bring attention to the fact that PTSD is not just a veteran issue. This is an American issue. This is a worldwide issue. And you may have heard that 22 veterans a day commit suicide. That's true. But what most people haven't heard is that 121 civilians in the general population commit suicide too. They have PTSD also. It's not a veteran problem. This is all over the United States. So, Dr. Gabor Mate, he's probably the leading addictionologist or addiction specialist in the world. And he says that undiagnosed trauma is the #1 predictor of addiction. And what's one of the leading problems with treating PTSD? It's over-medication. I myself, I was on 160 milligrams of OxyContin a day, 60 milligrams of roxicodone for breakthrough pain, 2 milligrams of Xanax a day, and 90 milligrams of Valium every single day. Any physician can tell you this is not a good idea. This is not a good idea for anyone to be on these kind of drugs in that sort of combination. But yet that's exactly what they do to us. Thankfully, that only lasted through the medevac, and afterwards, they put me on different drugs, but I continued to circle the drain for a very long time, several years after I got out. So when talking about these high levels of medication, we're losing 71,614 people a year, at least last year, to overdose. 71,000. That's more people than died in the Vietnam War. It's a massive number. And we're losing 44,965 people a year to suicide. So combine those two numbers together. This is a little known fact. For every successful suicide, there's 25 attempts. This is huge. This is a serious problem in America. So if you add those numbers up, you get 116,579 people who are dying in America, at least last year, dying because of what is essentially the same problem, and that's trauma, undiagnosed trauma. Find me one person that overdoses on a drug or one person that commits suicide by firearm or even hanging themselves or taking medicines that doesn't have trauma. I challenge anybody to find me one. They're not out there. But instead, we throw a lot of them in jail, heaping trauma upon trauma and just perpetuating the cycle. Studies have shown about a 75% reduction in PTSD scores. CAPS is the gold standard for measuring PTSD in the psychiatric community, and there is a 75% reduction in CAPS scores when patients use cannabis. That's a huge number. That is not statistically insignificant. That is hugely significant. And still, they are doing their best to prevent any kind of research on cannabis for PTSD. In 2014 is when I really got my introduction to the political process, when I started trying to help Sue Sisley of Arizona get $2.1 million to fund a landmark, triple-blind, placebo-controlled trial for cannabis in veterans with PTSD. She got that grant that year, and her study's now underway. We're just waiting on the results here in Colorado. But unfortunately, we really can't afford to wait. Veterans and civilians alike are dying right now, every single day, and people need access today, if not yesterday. So I filed a lawsuit in 2015 to force the state to recognize PTSD as a covered condition under our medical marijuana laws. And in 2017, we finally got a few sponsors for a bill called SB 1717, Allow Medical Marijuana for Stress Disorders. And it was signed into law on June 5th, 2017, and PTSD is now a covered condition for medical marijuana in the state of Colorado. Thank you. Honestly, most of the time I'm speaking to a cannabis crowd, but if we're going to stop 116,500 deaths a year from suicide and overdose, we can't really afford to leave any stones unturned. And there's a lot of other treatments out there. They're not all just cannabis. So this slide here is about MDMA, and I personally, I want to end the drug war in its entirety. There's not a single part of it that needs to still remain up. We need to take it apart piece by piece. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about civil asset forfeiture, we're talking about the over-incarceration rates, or if we're talking about Schedule 1 for any drug. There's no drug out there in existence that we cannot find a use for. And just because we haven't found one yet doesn't mean it's not out there. So clinical trials for MDMA and PTSD, they're actually taking place in Boulder right now. They're in phase 3. That's like the last phase. They're almost ready. They're almost done to approve it for treating PTSD. And I got to say, it's probably one of the best treatments out there. They've found, you see here on this slide, down at the bottom, 83% of participants were no longer even qualified as a PTSD patient after 2 months of therapy. Their CAP scores dropped so low, they no longer were PTSD patients, really. And then they came back and they tested them 3.8 years later? 3.8 years later, and what they had found, actually, you see over here on the right-hand side, their scores dropped even further from the 2-month post-treatment. So it's an extremely effective treatment for PTSD, especially if you use it in conjunction with cannabis. I know these are all like taboo subjects right here, but you know, we are pushing the envelope here in Colorado. We're leaders nationally in this. There are other drugs on Schedule 1. Ibogaine, it has a remarkable ability to completely cessate withdrawal from opium or opioids. So if somebody's out there and they're going to withdraw for heroin, you give them some Ibogaine and it will completely halt that process, and it will more than likely get them off the substance for good. 60% of patients report that they do. So psychedelics really, they provide a completely new and disruptive technology for the medical and pharmaceutical model for mental health, because they often only require a few applications before that their benefits become permanent, and then they last years and years with only a few applications. Ayahuasca is it's a South American jungle brew. It's made from a vine and a leaf, and it's also shown incredible anecdotal efficacy in PTSD. And I just recently made a movie we put out last year called Soldiers of the Vine about ayahuasca therapy. It follows myself and 6 other veterans as we go down to Peru and undertake the ritual. Like I said, anecdotally, the results, the improvements, were nothing short of amazing. So there's actually, I'll be appearing in another film about 3 different treatments: cannabis, ayahuasca, and MDMA. It'll be released this May at the Illuminate Film Festival in Sedona, Arizona. And but the list doesn't end there. Toad, 5-methoxy-DMT, that's another very powerful medicine for treatment of PTSD. But the real thing I want to talk to you about is psilocybin, because cannabis was the tip of the spear in changing the drug war, and changing these drug laws. But the next in line on the docket is psilocybin. Colorado for psilocybin and Denver for psilocybin have filed a ballot initiative in the city and county of Denver, and that's actually active right now. We're trying to get signatures so we can actually get it on the ballot to decriminalize the cultivation and the possession of mushrooms up to 2 ounces, I believe. And of course, there are some precedents. New Mexico Court of Appeals actually found that cultivation is not illegal in one of their cases. California has a statewide decriminalization effort. Hopefully it'll get decriminalized there, although I would love for Colorado to be first. And of course, the Denver City and County of Denver initiative is only for City and County of Denver, but it's a start. It's a move in the right direction. Peyote more than likely will see some efforts to legalize that in order to treat these same issues. It acts on all the same receptor subsystems that all of these other medicines do, and it can also have great efficacy in PTSD. This is the recipe for dismantling the drug war. It's our natural rights to stick a seed in the ground and watch it grow. There's no reality in which nature should be a crime. And nobody is free in America as long as nature is legal, period. So I'll wrap it up there. VNR, Veterans for Natural Rights. We want to end the drug war in its entirety. We want to end over-incarceration. And we want to stop civil asset forfeiture. Last year, actually, we passed a bill that was one of the first in the nations to limit the practice of civil asset forfeiture and get some accountability on it. And this year we'll be tweaking the bill a little bit more, but we are leading right now, and good job, Colorado. I am proud to be a Coloradan now, and I'm proud to support all these efforts. Thank you.
All right. Your questions? Yes, sir.
I'm Bill Robinson. I'm a lawyer and a libertarian. I've got a son who he had a back problem and then he had cancer, and so he was under he uses marijuana, and he also has the opioids. And recently, with this reduction, when I say he had the proper amount, he's been going along for years. His weight was down, he's doing, operating. Now, basically, the pain doctor has said, I cannot give you what you really need. So it's a choice between your life and my license, and you lose. It seems to me that, speaking of natural rights, there should be, and I'd like to see that you have litigated, and I've litigated for Tabor, and I'd like to, what's your take on, shouldn't there be because I think there's a lot of people like that who've been cut way down that shouldn't be cut down, and he was managing very nicely. Now, his weight has gone up, he can't do a lot of things, and at times he said that if this keeps going, he's suicidal. So I've got a good case to bring, and I think there must be a lot of other people, and I like what you said about ending the war on drugs, which of course is, the libertarians have said that for a long time. Do you have any thought as to what sort of a lawsuit? It would seem to me that you have the doctor involved, and he suggested that maybe you have it, and the doctor, didn't like that a bit, but we know who it is, and but the drug people, shouldn't we bring a lawsuit and possibly a class action because there must be a lot of other people in the same boat as he is on this cutting down that's totally irrational.
Yeah, in general, there's a fear from a lot of doctors that we're piling two drugs of abuse on top of one another with opiates and cannabis, and they're extremely leery of it, and they generally don't want to put those two substances together at all. When I first got here to Colorado, the very first thing they told me, I asked them, went to my VA doctor, I said, hey, I got to ask about medical marijuana. This is Colorado. And he said, if you haven't tried it, you should, but I can't give you opioids. And I was,
He's on board.
yeah, but he's getting reduced in the opioids because there is no real interaction between the two. There's worry about breathing, but all of that comes from the opioid side. The marijuana does not actually impact breathing, and it doesn't impact your heart rate, anything like that. The fears are a little bit unfounded. I think we need a little bit more study, absolutely. But ultimately, they're going to figure out that these medicines were made to be used together, and indeed they were for thousands of years.
To answer your other question about the legality side of it, so there's a reason why this is happening. The legislature decided, and I guess it was 2 years ago, or last session or the session before, they decided that the opioid problem in Colorado wasn't getting enough attention. So what they did was they couldn't attack the black market effectively. They were failing as it always fails. So what they did to try to manage it, which was a little bit ludicrous, is that they said, well, fine, let's control it at the doctor level because that's something we can manage. So that's where that dosing comes from. You need to go, that's where we have to go to the legislature and say, listen, we understand your intent was to try to get those numbers down, but it's a false intent because what it does is actually hurts people in the process. You have to find just like you do if you're taking too many opioids, you have to have a weaning process. You can't just simply flip a switch and expect patients to drop back down to a level that the state just deemed was valuable. So you're going to have to do it at the legislative level, but also you have to filing a lawsuit. It sounds like you're doing that. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to comment on whether it's a good idea or not. But there's certainly the reason behind it was to get the opioid numbers down. Meanwhile, marijuana was already dropping those numbers because it was legal in the state. So they wanted to double their bet and hedge their bet and drive the opioid addiction numbers down. That was the entire purpose of it. So it was short-sighted, most likely, and that's how it was birthed. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So we saw a lot of slides of a lot of different psychedelics, and I was wondering, is there a significant difference between all of the different ones, and I guess what is that in layman's terms?
There are lots of differences between them all, actually, and probably in terms of efficacy, for PTSD at least, Mdma right now is the leading candidate. There are certain things that the other ones can do that Mdma cannot. But right now it's all still very hazy. There's a lot of anecdotal reports, but we don't have a lot of clinical data. So right now we know for a fact that Ibogaine does wonders for addiction. It can completely eliminate addiction in a short weekend. And if they have repeated exposures to it, it can end it for lifetime too. So some of the psychedelic drugs are more, I like to call them entheogenic drugs, but they tend to focus on one aspect or another. Psilocybin mushrooms is a very great intro for people who have not ever experienced a hallucinogenic or psychedelic experience, and sometimes it really helps with people who have extreme fear, end of life, people with cancer. They've done an actual study on people with cancer with psilocybin, and it eliminates end of life fear of death. So all these things, they can be, we can probably tease a lot more very specific uses for these drugs out if we're allowed to study them, but as of now we're just not.
Have you ever crossed paths with the family court industry reform with like veterans or incarceration or anything like that?
Yeah, actually, a little bit. There are a few people in my sector of the state that have had some run-ins there, and in general, I hear some good things. I also hear some bad things. There have been some issues, especially dealing with veterans who are deemed to be, what do you call it? Disabled so much that they can't handle their own affairs, and then having kids taken away from them. I had a guy that has a TBI, although his wife is perfectly capable of taking care of children, and he's perfectly capable most of the time too. But he had an episode. He went into the hospital, and he lost his kids as a result. I don't think it was permanent. It was for a short period of time, but it was an abuse, definitely an abuse. But then I have heard other stories of adult vets who get into trouble here or there, and they get sent to veteran court and come out with a great deal. You know, yes, they did something wrong, they need to be punished, but they come out with a slightly more lenient punishment and more direction to try to help the community.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Tony Ryan. I used to be a federal police officer 36 years. I had something to do with marijuana mistake.
Just a little.
Just a little.
If you ever want to go on a tour, that'll open your eyes, let me know.
Help people decide to pass the policy, which I think has been beneficial for the state. So in that regard, I'm proud of that. With all these other drugs and all that, first of all, the war on drugs, as everybody with mind should know, is a big failure. In fact, it's exacerbated the problem. So no end, with no good result, in fact, except to make a lot of people in jail because they made bad choices, or maybe because they couldn't have access to it, as you said, a lot of drugs. Or for some reason the government doesn't want people to have access to it, but they help a lot. So where do we go with this? How do we get enough people together to join in with things and let's get over these drugs and make use of what they were. We're going to be a so-called Christian country that believes everything God gives is good. Yet we've decided, or some people decided, that you're punished if you have some natural substance. And anything can be abused. People overeat and die from getting too fat. We're eating too much corn or whatever, And so what's the difference, really? The way I look at it, what the heck is the difference? So why aren't more people standing up and saying, this is pure poppycock, we need to straighten it out? How do we get that to happen? How do we get people to realize that a group of people here in these counties and state, all over the country actually, decided to exercise some kind of self-imposed authority, keep people from using certain things. And if we abuse of anything, we get some nice potatoes you can fat down. We're going to make that really, you probably drink too much milk and have something go wrong with you too. I don't know. A doctor might know better than that. But, it's possible to die from all this anything. So I think more is
Except marijuana. Go ahead.
Well, yeah. So it's obvious. I think I want to decide. Let's explore these things, figure out what use they have, and discover what dangers there may be, like taking too many of your pain pills and try to make it a better society to help people rather than hinder them.
Yeah, I think I'll just start. I think part of it is what we're seeing at different levels. So at the county level, then all the way to cities, and then up to the federal level. The problem we always run into when you go from an activist movement to an actual policy movement, everything changes. So the activist movement is about an awareness that these things are good for us if we figure out how to administer them properly. They can help veterans. They can help everyday people who are dealing with all sorts of issues. They're holistic, they're natural, et cetera. Okay, so that's an argument that we all would agree that it's a pretty simple argument and it has a lot of logic. The problem is when you go to the current government we have, you start having an argument about things like unintended consequences. Well, we don't have a valid test for driving. How do I know if you're impaired?
I was about to say, why don't we prevent 501 driving?
Right.
Thousands of people get a year.
Yeah, so
Overused, if you will, the honor.
yeah, so but the problem we have is we have to navigate this very convoluted game of I have to address you sitting congressman, whoever you may be. I have to go in and address all of your constituents' issues around the impact to their culture. So how do I know that people aren't going to be high and driving, right? And so what happens in our state, and we've seen it, I know we've all seen this, that the numbers on driving with marijuana in your system have become inflated. Well, why are they inflated? Is it because more people are using marijuana and it's a huge now public safety risk? Or is it because that prior to 2013, we didn't even check for it when you got pulled over? It was never part of the screening process. In the emergency room visit, it was never part of it. So we have to have this full scale conversation. Sorry.
As a former police officer who I think was fairly observant in my career, shot, gang robberies, try to treat people fair and relaxing, who I spent most of my career. Most of them actually liked it, once I put in jail, because they had me put in jail. And why can't we have a different approach to a lot of these problems that tie into medicines that could be available to people that have all of these things? Your example, you're taking a drug that nobody would ever even allow 20, 40 years ago, you would have died. Or been, maimed or whatever for life, Now they're beginning to see that there's a benefit of these substances. In a society that claims that God created everything for good, why is it that we say so many things are bad? That just doesn't fit for me. It doesn't fit for me. Why isn't there more of a push in legislatures or whatever else, or groups of people like the Libertarian Party get together and demand we take a better look at this stuff, find the use for this stuff. The basic belief of this country is that all things were created for the good of man. And why are we letting people die, putting people in prison? Because some of these things are good. Should the Libertarian Party should work a little bit more actively. Try to make more noise.
Yeah. If I can jump in, each and every year when I was commissioner, I should say even every month, someone would come forward to say, hey, you need a new regulation, you need a new ordinance on the books to stop somebody from doing something. And we see it at our state capitol every year. 500 new laws typically go into effect. And it takes away, I'm a free market capitalist kind of guy in the sense that, self-accountability. If you want to go and utilize something that is making a difference for you, if it's a health benefit or if you just want to enjoy that aspect of your life and you are not infringing on anybody else's right of enjoyment, go for it. And unfortunately, there are those who want to impose their beliefs and their authority and their control over you to tell you what needs to be done and how it needs to occur. If you look at the Israeli government, it's a great example of, and I'm sure, Matt, you've seen their reports, they are the preeminent kind of testers out there and researchers developing those matrix for, hey, how does cannabis work within the PTS, somebody suffering from PTSD? How is it going forward? They did not shy away from it. And we as a government, we as from a local government side to a state to a national, need to allow those type of tests to occur and not go to the universities and say, hey, guess what? You just took federal money, so you can't do any of that research. You're taking away from an individual where it could really help them out and to open it back up. And that's where we need to keep driving the discussion. That's where we need to keep pushing and get out of those special interests that are pushing us to categorize all of us and to help us.
Yeah, that actually happened exactly with Dr. Sue Sisley. She advocated for just for studying the idea that cannabis might help people with PTSD, and was fired from the University of Arizona because of her advocacy just for science, not her advocacy for marijuana itself, but just for science to study it. So she actually had to go outside and get an independent review board to verify that her study design was good, and then she was able to move forward with the private monies that were received from other sources. She wasn't allowed to use actual university money that's dedicated to that. She had to find other sources of funding outside of the regulatory framework that they normally put up for these kinds of things, and she's pushing forward for it outside of the bounds that they set up. It's kind of the only way to go about pushing the movement further is to do things that are outside of their box. And I don't know if you've noticed, but in the last 20 years in America, we've changed the entire country on this issue. On cannabis, it's like 86%, something like that, nationally approval. That's way more popular than any politician out there, not a single one. So, you know, marijuana is more popular than just about anybody right now, anybody or anything. We changed that through a very long campaign of information, not disinformation, because we were getting fed disinformation before by DARE and the war on drugs and all that stuff, but actual information. And putting that stuff out there, having real deal sit-down conversations, calm conversations, collected conversations, presenting data and fact, that's the kind of thing that changes everybody's minds. And that's why we're here where we are now, today.
Sorry.
With most libertarian issues, it's pretty straightforward. Here's the answer. But as you mentioned, with this particular one, it's a lot more complicated than we want it to be. The two big issues that I see to getting wholesale acceptance, etc., you touched on both. The first one is the medical industry as it stands now. I mean, I've always said that you have to make sure that the people who are making the money get to continue to make money, or you're never going to actually win. So the first question is how do we get Big Pharma to still be a player and be able to do what they do and not fight it? And then the other is acceptance of the general population. It comes down to what you had mentioned, which is the driving. There is no test for telling whether you're under the influence. The test for THC stays in your body for up to a week, and so you may not be under the influence, but it shows you are, and we're going to arrest you anyway. So those are the two biggest issues that I see. What do you see as potential solutions, or where are we in getting potential solutions to those two?
You want to start? Or start?
Sure, I just got something brief there. There's a bill that's coming around this year. It's a GW Pharma Bill. It's designed to actually bring GW Pharma into Colorado and allow it to sell Sativex, which is its CBD-based drug. It is a synthetic form of CBD. There are a lot of cannabis people who are totally and absolutely, utterly against it. But it's not a bad drug. It's CBD. It's no different than like CBD isolate that you would extract from a hemp plant and then packaged up. No doubt that whole plant therapy is 100% better, 1,000% better. But it is the pharmaceutical industry's attempt to get into the market, and I think that there's probably room for them, for all the people that are a little bit too scared to go outside their box and grow their own plants and make their own medicine. But there are those people out there, and they'll be willing to pay the higher price for GW's product. So I don't think it's a mutually exclusive thing. I think pharma can participate here too.
Yeah, I think I think there are two parts of there are two questions there, and there are two problems. The first is, I'll go to the second question, which is really about how do we systemically change the culture in the country. And I think part of that is people who are consumers, like him and me and others. We have to also stand up and say we are consumers. So for the longest time, marijuana specifically has been this thing people do in their basements, or they hide, or they don't tell their kids, but meanwhile they got wine and liquor and billboards, and it's nonsense, right? Right. Yeah. You're welcome. But I think you know, and we're seeing it because, you know, in our family, my wife and I don't drink anymore. We just are cannabis people. And there's nothing funnier than telling someone that and watching their reaction. You go, no, I don't drink. I'm just into cannabis. And they go, oh, so you smoke weed? I go, well, I smoke sometimes. Other times it's an edible. Other times it's a beverage. It's like in a root beer. And they go, excuse me, what? And they go, yeah, it comes in a root beer. And so it's the mainstream acceptance of it, which is also part of the discussion around consumption. So until I can go to a bar and order a weed soda, and he orders a beer and he gets a Coca-Cola, we're not going to be mainstream with this. So until society demands that it's like that, it won't change in society. Until we still go to our dinner parties and drink wine and have no alternative that's cannabis friendly, then we are part of the problem. And then on just changing the policy side of it, the GW Pharma, like you said, is going to come in. But make no mistake, when federal legalization occurs, and it will occur, it'll either occur in the next few years because Congress will get its head on straight, which is an oxymoron, or it will, or God willing, a libertarian president will come in 2020 and change the whole thing. But I think at some point, it's going to become legal. And when it does, make no mistake, GW Pharma, Anheuser-Busch, Marlboro, all those companies are coming into the space, and they're going to take it over. So at the federal level, we have to also make sure that we're creating smart policy so that companies like that, we have a client here who has 658 employees. They make $100 million in revenue a year just in Colorado, and they have 15 locations in this state. Well, if we don't also try to simultaneously find a home for them, they're just going to get wiped out. GW Pharma is not going to ask permission to come in and make a drug that takes them over. The problem, though, that's slowing it all down at the federal level is that GW Pharma, Altria, all these major brands, they can't figure out how to control it. Is it recreational or is it medical? Yep. So if it's recreational, then GW Pharma doesn't get to have it. If it's medical only, then they get to have it, but no one else does. So where does it sit? And everybody has an argument for that. So that's the stuff we're sorting out every day, all day long. How do we create a glide path that says it's both medical and recreational, which is the only difference is intent. And now we got to build rules around the intent so that big players can come in and play, which they're going to anyway, but also small players can too. So that's the work we do all the time.
So do you see any good in maybe speaking out a little more loudly about how use of alcohol is legal?
Yeah, we do it every day.
Police
Yeah.
officers, just because of alcohol consumption, but marijuana is not legal anymore. So how do we try to adjust this?
The only thing I would caution us on there, and then I'm going to let Don speak, but the only thing I would caution us on, when you build a false equivalency to alcohol and you try to vilify one over the other, you just create a bigger problem. Because then they say, oh, you mean marijuana is just as dangerous or similar to it? So you have to put it in its own universe, right? Go ahead, son.
Well, I was going to say the alcohol industry is scared. And if you look recently, senior vice president for Molson Coors left to do what? Go to Canada to run a cannabis company because he said cannabis is the new way. People are stopping, like Todd and his wife, from drinking alcohol and using cannabis, and they feel it's a better option for them. They are scared. It's taking away market share from them. So you have these big companies who are trying to move into that space. At the same time, you have space that is not yet clearly defined. And talking about impairment, you bring up a good point. As a former law enforcement officer, you know what? Texting, right? I tell you what, eating your Big Mac and your French fries and your soda, whether then be alcohol or impairment, how does that impairment look on the road to a police officer, to a sheriff's deputy? How to be able to understand that impairment, how to adequately address that impairment and help that individual go in the right direction. That's key for law enforcement. That's key for not only Colorado, but for our nation, because I can tell you what, this impairment is a huge impairment, right?
There's that, but I'll go back to the legal drug, alcohol. And I don't think a lot of, maybe most people don't know this. And there's probably over 50% of the calls the police service have to do with alcohol, whether it's domestic violence, accidents on the roadways, accidents at work. So alcohol is behind a lot of stuff, and yet it's legal. And so it's a lack of education. Because I don't think making something illegal solves the problem. I think it's obvious as in marijuana. It will solve the problem. It kept us from solving other problems. But where's our education? To say, you can do
Some of the biggest, some of the biggest names out there who are against the legalization of marijuana in the state of Colorado will sit there and claim the bad effects of marijuana in society as they're sitting there holding a glass of wine. And they refuse to look at the numbers. They refuse to look at the data. And, you know, at that point, you just have to keep with the education and keep working with them. But at some time, you just have to say, they just, for whatever reason, they're just going down that road for whatever, money, for influence.
It occurred to me when I was in the traffic division, you know, what they call the traffic investigations squad. I got detective, except we went out and reconstructed who had accidents, criminal accidents.
Yeah.
And all of death and destruction of man bodies and all that kind of alcohol and economic it's just critical. And it's so sad to see it. People driving around the road with their kids in the backseat, having them tied down. And don't have an accident, it's just bad. So just like I said before, no show.
There's two more
I
questions.
understand why, you know, alcohol is okay, marijuana is not.
Right.
I'm sorry, just, so the second question that I had, and we're just talking about the impairment, since you work in the industry, do any of you know where we are on the testing for impairment, or have we made any
Yep.
strides in that?
So in Colorado, there was an attempt to create basically a level of it's 5 nanograms, and it's basically the THC activated in your system. It's a failed method because people like me who consume cannabis on a daily basis, I probably wake up at 10 to 15 nanograms. So it makes no sense. I would get pulled over, and if I had a blood test, I'd be in trouble. So there have been numerous companies, one out of Boulder, there's another out of Los Angeles, that have tried to create a technology similar to a breathalyzer type technology. It's an instant blood check. It does all these different things. The problem with it is, again, it depends on what you've eaten, who you are, how much you consume. There just aren't any studies yet, and part of it is like he was talking about, because there haven't been any universities allowed to study it. There's a doctor here in Colorado right now who's about to launch the first ever driving under the influence of marijuana study, where he's going to take 90 participants over the course of 3 years, starting now, and he's going to they're going to come in and he's going to administer cannabis to them, and then they're going to be in a driver simulation, and the goal is to see how cannabis will affect them in their impairment, and they're in different levels. Some of them are new users, some of them have for years. The problem, he said, though, is that he only got funded for smoking. He didn't get funded for vaping, for edibles, for any other form of consumption imaginable. It was just smoking, which is actually not what concerns most people. What concerns people is that a soccer mom who has a backache takes an edible at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and thinks she's going to be fine in an hour to pick her kids up, finding that she's in the line at school completely high and doesn't know what impairment is, or let alone how. See, so the irony is we don't have enough data to make the decisions about impairment. But to Don's point, we need to have a bigger conversation about impairment, because we're all impaired on the road for about a million other reasons that have nothing to do with
Distraction and impairment are two different things.
Yeah.
I can sit the phone down, I'm no longer distracted, I can't just not be under the influence
Right,
of something.
right, and to his
So-
point, if you start layering things, if you've got oxycodone and cannabis and alcohol and you're depressed, now you're impaired on a level.
Far exceeds anything you can do alone.
There is no test.
There is no.
So can't there just be a broad test for impairment itself?
I think that's what they're leaning towards, especially with cannabis.
There's so many drugs already available, and a lot of them, whether it be some of the other ones you mentioned up there, they test for impairment.
Yeah. Cannabis is they're trying to figure out, because there's no reliable, here at this blood nanogram limit you are this impaired. There is nothing like that in cannabis. So they're kind of leaning more towards, we have to prove impairment through actual physical assessment, on the side of the road, walking the line, hands to the nose, all that stuff.
And
This is true. Yeah.
right, well,
I know that.
Yeah.
and,
Why checkpoints don't catch people either, so.
No.
Yeah, I mean, that's why education is really, consumer-based education is where the future is going to be. And the thing Don and I, and we all probably talk about all the time is, if alcohol were illegal yesterday and legal today, we'd all have to learn how to get drunk, right? So marijuana is now going to be legal. It's going to be legal federally eventually. We better all learn how to deal with it as a culture. And frankly speaking, we're finally starting to see the industry do better at that education. Government does terrible at that education. So it's really going to take independent individuals and operators and companies to say it's important enough that we have to educate the consuming base, period. I mean, that's really going to be the line of defense, not blood tests every quarter mile. That won't get us there, unfortunately.
The money banking, is that still a problem? It still can, so still